about their architecture, particularly to them. But I've drawn a wide and deliberately slightly provocative list. I've deliberately avoided almost anybody who gets more than the occasional representation in current journals, because I think they get lots and lots and lots of mileage. Everybody's got an opinion about them. There's the odd person who you will have heard of, but only the odd one. I would be intrigued to know if anybody sitting in the audience has heard of all of them. Not that I want that to be its criterion. What I simply want to do is, as I did last week and the week before, is to take a sort of disparate group of people and I suppose, in a way, make them representative of phenomena, of approaches, of syndromes. And those of you who have a real taste for architecture and its gossip and its and come from, obviously, a lot of different places, I would like you to be able to identify interesting architects. I would like you to develop the taste for finding interesting architects from wherever you come. I doubt whether there's any part of the world, with the possible exception of the North Pole, and even there, who knows, that doesn't have an interesting architect somewhere. And I think you can learn more from interesting architects than those who have lines and lines and lines of books in the bookshop. I deliberately come on from last week. I remember showing probably this picture of him, and one, I hope, tantalizing page from the magazine of the Swiss Architecture Museum, which is the last magazine that I know that has done any coverage of Pancho Geddes' work. And it's odd that it comes from the Swiss, isn't it? He is a old, fruity, arty, gossipy, totally out of fashion Portuguese who lived in the Mozambique. And yet, the Swiss magazine not only picked up on him, but the Architecture Museum of Basel gave him an exhibition only a matter of months ago. The explanation, of course, is that the director of that museum and editor of the magazine is herself, I think, one of the most original architectural observers. And she's called Francesca Ferguson. Interestingly, also, she is half English, half German, and has found this job in Basel, which should be considered as a kind of pivot point in the European scene, though is usually associated with a certain kind of sort of screen-like Swiss architecture. This magazine picks up on the fact that he built 400 buildings in Africa. I remember him telling me, and this was already 25 years ago, he says, I've done 400 buildings. He has now done a few more because the politics of the Mozambique changed. He had to leave town rather quickly, and he went to South Africa, where in fact he had gone to architecture school, and where his wife had come from. And he became the head of the School of Architecture at Witwatersrand, which is in Johannesburg. But the thing that propped up on the table when David Green and I were working 47 years ago in a W1 office, a neat W1 office, was an issue of the Architectural Review, and it had this weird stuff in it, this very sculptural stuff. Was it Biscuit? Was it Gaudi? Was it what quite was it? I guess it's impossible to do 400 really good buildings, particularly if some of them have to be constructed very simply, very quickly. And he recourse to basically reinforced concrete with a lot of decorative elements, most of which he directed or even probably did himself. He is a sculptor and a painter, but not as sort of so volumetrically as Paolo Soleri. And some of the houses are fairly straightforward. They are built for, orthodox families. Their plan form might be seen as being derivative of even sort of Louis Kahn architecture. And I'll come to it in a minute, but the plan of his that most has fascinated me over the years, and I still use it as reference, is a plan that he did for a hotel building. Unfortunately, it was not built, but it is an absolutely zonking, weird plan. Now, you can see that he also did some incredibly, what would now be seen as boring commercial work. Don't forget he did 400 buildings. And he was just building like the clappers. And some of it got fruity and molded, and the drawings always take it, of course, 1 or 2 stages further than the built object. What the hell the Mozambicans made of it, I have no idea. They probably, and it would be too simple to say, well, they didn't know the difference. I'm sure they did. I'm sure the guy that was doing the sort of shuttering work knew the difference. And the red illustrations, red and pink, are to the roof plan and general ground plan of his hotel, which is very intriguing because those of us who've done projects for hotels will rapidly see that he doesn't do the conventional arrangement of the placing of the bathrooms near the entrance. He does have also an entrance floor, an entrance area, which would have the hotel reception, etc. But then he kind of plays strange games with it. It's easy for us to say, well, yes, it's fruity, but what is his taste? I think architects such as this always fall into the questionable area where taste is concerned. Because after all, there are a lot of people in architecture schools particularly and in publishing houses telling you what you should like, what is not polite architecture. My own view is that it's dated as hell and some of it's a little bit horrible, but my God, it had balls. My God, it had presence. My God, it used reinforced concrete, done presumably by only semi-skilled artisans, although I would need to check that. I shall be seeing him next month in Lisbon because he's got a very big retrospective coming up, and I will ask him about that. So here's this guy, and David Green and I, working in this fairly straight up and down office, suddenly were confronted with this stuff. We were confronted, it was a period when the Architectural Review did a series of issues with very provocative covers done by another one was somebody who's totally disappeared from view, an Australian called Jason Pickford, and there were others. If you wanted to collect weird shit icons, the Architectural Review of the period about 1959 to 1964 was where to go. Extraordinary to think of that, a very otherwise international professional magazine. But even weirder for me to think of this being republished in Switzerland. Sorry this is upside down, but what it does show is that there was a wide variety of his work. And he's still around, and I'm told from the Portuguese scene that he is being treated very seriously again whilst he still lives. There he is with his son, who taught in this place for in fact, people in the front row who will remember Pancho Geddes. And there's Pancho helping his dad make something or other. And then I move on to somebody I have talked about before in this room, Terunobu Fujimori, and I have written about him. The last time I think I talked about him, I described him as the person I most want to meet, having been bowled over by his work in the Venice Biennale before last. And in December, I was lucky enough to actually be in Tokyo, and I did go to meet him. What was fascinating was having read the excellent book about his work and the way in which the writer of the book had described that Fujimori was a very sort of jovial, interesting character, a historian architect, trained as an architect, but a historian architect, a professor in Tokyo University, no less, who had started to do buildings well into his professorial period. It should move. And here we are. There is Fujimori in his yard. In fact, the house is in what I would describe as the sort of equivalent of Watford in Tokyo. That is to say, you have to take a train from an inner suburb, and you have to stay on the train for quite a while, bearing in mind that Tokyo is twice the size of London. And then after about 3/4 of an hour, you get off, and Fujimori's wife collects you because you'd never find the place otherwise. And thank God she had got a master's degree in English literature, because he doesn't actually speak English, but the translation was very smooth. And there he is in this yard. Now, the house is actually built in a suburb which until recently was sort of little market gardens and farms. And bits of the farming are still there, and he's still got some chickens and stuff in a hut. And then behind him you see the house, which looks a little bit smarter in the photographs in the book, of course, which things always do. Other stuff in the book, of course, are these kind of what we would here call Wendy houses. I didn't actually see this for real, but having seen the one real building, I can extrapolate. That's the thing you have to do with pursuing architecture, is, the chances of getting to see all the things that somebody interesting has done require a lot of legwork or ticket money. But if you see one or two things, and you meet the guy, and then you look at them again, you can generally extrapolate. You can imagine what they would be like if it wasn't such a smart photograph. One of the giveaways is that the surfaces of his architecture are very important. He has written in the book quite a lot about using traditional techniques and so on and so forth. Very nice man. Very interested in Voisey, for those who might wonder. And there is his house. The trees that look fairly sort of vibrant in the book look as if they're having a bit of a rough time in the Tokyo winter. But there it is. It's almost handmade. I think I'm not sure whether he actually himself got up the ladder, but I think it has that sort of you do it yourself at home look about it, with which I'm extremely familiar myself. If you want to do a bit of architecture, you haven't got a lot of money, you bloody do it yourself to your own house. And there's certain evidence of that there. There's obviously mannerism. There is the limit of not having a lot of money to roll around. He's, after all, on a professorial salary and has kids and all that. And it's interesting that this particular house, not unexpectedly, is tacked on to an existing house. You can see a bit of the existing house on the left. So it's all familiar stuff. There's a waste bin. Interestingly, you take tea cross-legged on the floor of the main room. But if you look diagonally through the door, you can see a perfectly normal Western-style dining table. And the loos have the same sort of toilet rolls that we have here. It's all pretty, it's disarmingly normal. There is this man who has put his brain into loving architecture, and what little money he has, I don't say he's poverty-stricken, but he's a professorial salary. It's not a big deal. I guess he gets bits of fees from the things he does now. And he goes in on the train twice a week to Tokyo University, just like people do. And his wife carries a carrier bag and has a small car, just like people do. It's very reassuring that you see this stuff in the Biennale, and you think, the guy's got to be a nutter. You see it in this extremely beautiful book, and you say, my God, the guy's a successful nutter. Actually, the guy's one of us. He's there. And I find that very refreshing. Maurice Lapidus is somebody who I met a few years ago in Austria, of all places, but he was already quite old and quite grand. I think he went on to be 98 years old, so I can't quite place how old he was when I met him, but it was in 1980. And he was like a sort of Californian film star, except that he was actually a Floridan character. And it was Lapidus who designed the Fontainebleau Hotel, which is always referred to as the sort of schmaltz world of the 30s and 40s, or 40s, I guess. Two famous films, one called Bellboy and one called Goldfinger, were filmed in this hotel. So this is where sort of art meets life, that the escapist world of the movie, the escapist world of going down to Florida, particularly if you live in the northeastern industrial part of the United States, goes with a certain kind of architecture. Now, of course, again, like Pancho's work, it looks pretty ordinary now, except you have to put it in. And here he is, in typical architect's pose, about to unfurl his project to some. He's looking kind of Floridan and smooth, and he obviously was Floridan and smooth, although he'd been born in the Ukraine or somewhere. But he was about to unroll it and please everybody. I only have black and white photos of this, taken from a little book that I found about him. Here we see, again, it's a sort of period piece of slightly overfed people enjoying themselves by the pool, as one does in Florida. Early bit of borrowed Felix Candela, early bit of borrowed Dublin bus station, early bits of borrowed modernism. I don't think he cared too much where it came from. This would have probably been more funky had it been done by Pancho Geddes, but I'm sure that Maurice Lapidus was far too busy to stop and flute it away. He must have been what in Japan they call a bit of a producer. And some stuff which is very, still, if we take away our taste buds, if we take away the strictures by which such things should not be treated as proper architecture, we actually can analyze that the business of bringing a sort of stalactite-like column down through a recessed light source is not actually a bad idea. Lots of people don't know what to do with recessed light sources. Lots of people don't know what to do with columns. Lots of people don't know what to do with stalactites, and a hell of a lot of people don't know what to do with a leather-padded seat back. Lapidus knows. And I think we can, it's very good for our sort of taste buds to analyze this absolutely straight up as a piece of architecture. Yes, Niemeyer can do waving concrete better, more purely. It makes Niemeyer look like an absolute purist, as I was showing you last week. But nonetheless, Lapidus knew how to put it all together. And there he is later on, having been in the sun, presumably rather too much, though it didn't do him any harm if he made it to 98, not having to have the keenness of his roll of drawings. He can, presumably by this time, the work comes to him. And anyhow, what the hell, if it doesn't, he's probably got a nice place around the corner somewhere. Now, Lapidus looks absolutely straight down the line by comparison with Carlo Molino. Carlo Molino, Italian, followed the occult. He raced in Le Mans speed races. He flew aeroplanes. He crashed aeroplanes at least twice. And you see that his chosen photograph is to show him with his helmet. Thank God he had a helmet, I suppose. And he made extraordinary exotic furniture, which now finds a very, very high price amongst the collectors. What is intriguing, and it was my wife who commented on that while she was doing some research on him, that in fact he was virtually blocked by the rather smarter Italian architecture critics. And another thing that I was reading only this morning suggests that since he came from Turin, he grew up in Turin, his father was a Turin architect, it enabled him not to fall in the trap of being in Milan. In other words, had he been in Milan, which was much more of an epicenter of the design world, would he have been dragged into it? But by being sort of up the road somewhere in Turin and being presumably extremely exotic, he also took erotic photographs of ladies and was very good at it. So there we are. This extraordinary guy living in this slightly secondary town in Italy. And he makes Lapidus look sort of ornery, I think. I'm not suggesting that only the exotic architects are interesting. What I am suggesting, as I often do, is that the kinds of strictures, the kinds of references, kinds of standards, the kinds of included names, whether you're reading Tafuri or whether you're listening to one of your professors, tend to suggest that these people either don't exist or shouldn't exist. There's a wonderful story that I once heard from Toshio Nakamura, who was for a long time the editor of A+U in Tokyo. He was in Vienna, and his various contacts had made a list of things that he should see and therefore publish. But he happened to see something out of the window of his taxi, quite a long distance away, which was not on the list. He insisted on being taken to it. And it was, in fact, Günter Domenig's famous Z-Bank, quite an exotic piece. And I may have told you this before, but anyhow, what was fascinating was that he then went and saw all the things that all the people had told him to see, blah, 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 blah. And then he had that bank photographed. And when the issue on Austria came out, the bank was on the cover, much to the kind of nail-biting on the part of the local mafia, who at that time considered Domenig to be a bit of a wanker, I think. Now, another man who has an equally fascinating story, though a much more serious person, is MIG Wealthy Zack. I was introduced to him about 4 years ago or so, just before he died, I guess. He was already quite old. He was 90-something. And he had done a lot of research on housing. He was interested in prefabricated housing, very small man. When I saw him, he was in his house, in a house that he'd obviously lived in for a long time, completely surrounded by suburbia and flyovers and concrete roads and so on. It was as if he was in a little island. And there he was. He did some pretty intriguing stuff. He did some villas where he did kind of quilted in situ concrete and the openings with strange rounded corners. Not a lot of people do quilted in situ, I found. He did a lot of work on prefabrication. He invented various systems of locking together precast concrete and would use them for office buildings and, in this case, I think, a church. He did this building, which was called the Pagoda, which was pulled down rather viciously, but was obviously an extraordinary piece of work. I think a building of the 50s or 60s. And here's more evidence of his locked precast work. More quilting. Able to do quite casual buildings. This looks like as if Sigurd Leverance has had a kind of Japanese hat put on him, which I find quite intriguing. A very, very, very inventive architect indeed. And something happened. The story that I have received is that he was part of Opus Dei, the religious group, and fell out with them. And since they are extremely powerful on the Spanish scene, they blocked him for about 15 years from building. Interestingly, I've just read that the guy, during that 15 years of not doing very much building, found a very young journalist wife and had lots and lots of children whilst he wasn't building, which is a nice story. But what an inventive guy. I can remember when I was a student here doing things with interlocking blocks and the roof and so on. And he was not afraid. He didn't mind taking the glass right up to the corner of the structure. He didn't mind quilting and then quilting differently. He didn't mind then using quilt together with sheer plate glass. He was very inventive. One slightly wonders what would have happened. I seem to have got in there in the wrong place. What would have happened if he had not been screwed around by Opus Dei and hadn't had the children? Maybe he had the right choice. He lived long enough to be able to come back into the architectural game. And, of course, round the corner, so to speak, is another now dead Spanish architect of roughly the same generation called Francisco Odessa. I took a very large group of Bartlett students to his office once. I think there were about 50 people. And he gave a 3-hour lecture in his flat, which could hardly contain all the students. And he went on and on and on and explained everything. And he was already sort of in his late 80s. And he was just such an amazing enthusiast. So this raises also the issue of being an interesting architect. It happens that he was a rather good architect and a rather original architect. I think the Torre Bianca is still one of the exciting buildings of Madrid. But he was also an enthusiast to the last. And that helps. I didn't expect every one of the students to necessarily like this stuff, although they mostly, as I remember, found it really intriguing when they got close to it. But my God, the guy was amazing. They all came away saying, my God, that guy, wow. And was talked about for days and weeks afterwards. Now, I wonder, there again will be one or two people sitting here who will recognize what this is. This is an intriguing piece of building where prefabricated bathrooms were stacked around a concrete core with a ramp running around them. Some wild kid, you would expect, perhaps in South America, perhaps in Spain, perhaps somewhere exotic, but no, it's in London. I think it's been pulled down. And it was done by Sir Nicholas Grimshaw when he was a very young architect, when he was only probably 2 or 3 years out of this place. And Terry Farrell as well, intriguingly. So that's a funny thing. An architect can be very interesting at a certain period in their work. Somebody who I think was interesting right the way through, again, of variable taste, was Bruce Gough. There is an extension to the County Museum of Art in Los Angeles, which is not Gough at his best. But when you take some of the houses, you find that he was extremely inventive. He was the first person, or the only person I've heard of at that point, who used pieces of glass worked into stone rubble walling, so that the actual thing that let the light through was, in a sense, indistinguishable from the bits that didn't let the light through. So as if you say there's a scatter, rather like a tweed. You scatter it, and then you say some of it will let the light through, and some won't. Rather than having, as one might put it, the tyranny of the window opening. And I then moved to another American who I don't know, who's much, much younger, working in Arizona, called Rick Joy. This is another architect who I would like to meet, because he works like a sculptor, and he works very much indigenously to the region, although it can be said that he's influenced by Richard Serra and Donald Judd. Nonetheless, he is very much an inventive architecture. And I suppose the people that I rate as interesting are those that invent. That would be my criterion. They might be conversationally interesting. They might have a story to tell, but when push comes to shove, my own criterion would be that they are inventive. Sometimes there's an architect who is known locally, and because the level of what they do is established, and because they're known for doing other things, people stop to check or remember that they are actually very interesting and very inventive. This is a man called Ray Capet, who many would say his claim to fame was that he invented the school of architecture called SCI-Arc. He founded it. He put his own money where his mouth was and dragged all his best students, which included Tom Main and Eric Moss and others, who were young teachers at Pomona, where he'd been running the school. He took them and made a new school. But in addition, he is the quintessential Californian architect. His own house has a stream that runs under the building and has amazing sort of cantilevers. And when I last went there, which is about 4 years ago, he's still around, he's still doing building. He was playing Miles Davis, as one would, and he was sitting, leaning back, very comfortably. He looks extremely laid back, but if you look at this architecture, if you scrutinize it, you find it has a very high level of invention and understanding what it's doing. It happens not to be fashionable, except that in certain circles in the United States, there's stuff like this being done now by people who hadn't checked out that Capet and Co. had already done it. There is, as I always like to include, the temptation of the open city at Valparaiso in Chile. I don't know any, I mean, I can look them up, but I don't know really who designed this building, whether it's done by a collective or by somebody sort of hustling a collective. But sure as hell, if you're interested in interesting architecture and interesting architectural phenomena, one should try and find a way of getting out there. Extraordinary, weird, loose, and occasionally very interesting stuff. I like to go in Amsterdam to see the work of de Klerk. I live in a part of London which has buildings that are imitations of Dutch architecture. But if you want to see the real McCoy of what can be done in Northern Europe with brick, you have to look at de Klerk. It's picturesque, it's highly evocative, it's very clever, and it's sort of point of departure, as far as I'm concerned, for what you can do with brick architecture. But then we should not forget our own and close and dear people. It's very easy, because if you pick up BD, you're always reading about some latest sort of near tragedy that Will Alsop has got himself into. You know, is he about to become bankrupt, or is he about to lose out to this, or be bought by that, or what's he doing? And he would appear here fattened with a cigar and so on. But actually, he's a very inventive architect. And just because he's rather like Capet, just because it's easy to categorize him in one kind of way, we should not forget our objectivity in assessing his inventiveness over really, by now, quite a long period of time. I'm fascinated by Lars Spoybrook of Knox. I think of the people who work in the, what can I call it, digital world. He's an interesting odd one, because I don't think he sits comfortably. I think he's too arty. I think he's too original. He doesn't just play the parametric rules and let them take him wherever they will. He's too, and that's probably why he's not quite as much a household word as some of his friends, because he's too much of an architect. This is my personal view. The stuff is very original, happens to be, and he's Dutch, but he's not boring Dutch. Category of underrated, I've on many occasions before said that I think that the building in Munster by Bollis Wilson, because it's unfashionable, it's grossly underrated. It's a superb building, and they still do some quite good stuff as well, but are definitely underrated. There are people like Hodgetts and Fung in the Los Angeles scene, who if you stop and look at the bits, are rather better than their reputation as being sort of a bit of this and a bit of that. I think there are some architects who are bugged by having come out of the commercial world in their origins. This is Max Skogen and Merrill Elim, who originally were commercial architects who got together and started to make some very original buildings. Mac was for a while the chairman at Harvard, and I have the feeling that the other people at Harvard sort of slightly treated him as a bit too much of a builder, although he's actually a very good critic, as is his wife. But people get trapped by the context sometimes. What I urge you to do is to stop and just look at the stuff, as I was lucky enough to do. I think there are people all over the place that are more than usually interesting, like Klaus Kader in Graz. Or in history. When I first came to London a long time ago, I went to see everything I could find done by these three guys who were what you read about vis-a-vis modern architecture in England. They happened to be colonials. I think one was from Kenya, one was from Australia, and one was from Canada, or wherever they were from. But they were actually the best of the bunch. Now, I guess, if you can find their stuff, it looks very much, you know, you say, oh, well, you know, it's not as good as Corbusier, it's not as good as André Lersa, it's not as good as... But actually, they represented for me, at that time, which is 50-odd years ago, a kind of beacon that England could be a modernist country. It was a sort of almost unclutchable dream. So the interest can be in terms of context. It can be best, like we say on the Crufts Dog Show level of analysis, best of breed. You know, in Crufts Dog Show, you have the best bulldog or the best gun dog or the best hound. Or something. Doesn't mean you're the best dog, but it's certainly worth looking at the one who's best at being a gun dog. Collingwood and Lucas were the best of the British modernists before the Second World War. Though obviously you could go to Czechoslovakia or wherever and find better. But the fact that you could see it was very important. I've just got a handful more of stuff. If I can get that one off the screen, yes. And I always have this trouble when I'm moving from. Yeah. Okay. There are some projects that you are haunted by, that you can't get out of your brain. This is a project for a house done by Stanley Seitovitz. Did I mention this last week? I can't. No. I was looking for it last week and couldn't find it. It's a built building, and Seitovitz made it when he was 23 years old. He has since become a Californian architect. He's left South Africa, which is where it was made, and he, I think, hasn't done anything quite as good since, but it was fascinating that it was Zaha Hadid herself, who was teaching here, who brought Stanley Seitovitz for us to meet. Incidentally, Zaha, when she was teaching here, was very good at bringing people that you hadn't heard of. It was she who introduced Lebbeus Woods to this place. Jumping about a bit, this is work of Herb Green, the one most famous house that he did, called the Chicken Shack House. And it's just down the road from the work that was done by Bruce Gough. They were clearly working on at the same faculty and trying to outdo each other with the strangeness of their work. And Herb Green came once to give a lecture at the AA. And it was a sort of funny lecture because he's very sort of down-home American. And he's since sort of moved over to California and become an artist. Now he's sort of being like a Californian artist with a beret. So in a funny way, has slipped out of the architectural conversation. Another person who I never can resist, haunting as hell, was this person. The building is in Berlin. It was done in the 1960s, I think, by a very odd guy called Ludwig Lair. It's a water testing laboratory for the Technical University. It's very near the Technical University. It's quite easy to find. You can see it from one of the S-Bahn routes very clearly. And it does, you have to bear in mind that I saw it first, I think, in 1971 when I had finished doing the early phase Archigram stuff and had been a tremendous fan of Chernikov's 101 Fantasies. And I saw this thing, and it was like a Chernikov 101 fantasy built. And it reminded me of the Archigram period of putting things up on legs, but it was built. And it's a blue box on green legs with this extraordinary pink pipe. It's not striped, it's just a bad slide. And he's done 2 or 3 other buildings, but the other major building that he's done is this one, which is on the western end of Berlin, on one of the lakes, which is a life-saving institute. And the boats where they learn to do the life-saving are hauled up the side of the building and slotted in. Now you must bear in mind again my own position as an Archigram person. There again was a plug-in building, but with boats. Extraordinary architect, very weird guy, a very difficult guy. I had one afternoon with him, along with Edoardo Palazzi, who seemed to know him. And then once he realized we were getting interested in him and wanted to publish him, he disappeared. He avoided us the next few times we were in Berlin. He did not want to be exposed and published. That's why his stuff appears in so few books. He's still alive, I believe. And very strange. He was an East German Marxist, but a professor in West Germany, which also puts, or in West Berlin. So there are many intriguing things about him. Oh, this is in the wrong place, but this is the most famous of Bruce Gough's houses in Norman, Oklahoma, near to the Chicken Shack, and remains for me a very haunting image of what is possible as a drape, almost like a boat, but with this stone where if you look carefully you can see it has glass elements amongst it. The sort of haunting image that when you actually go to see it does not put you off. Sometimes something is haunting in a grainy photograph or something. You get there and it's a bit ordinary. No way with this stuff. No way. There's Jeffrey Bawa, who is now a very fashionable person to discuss. He's dead some years. He was a student here at the AA and didn't become an architect until he was 38. He had been a lawyer before that. He returned to Sri Lanka and built these very beautiful, haunting buildings, always among trees. There's Walter Pickler, who is not, strictly speaking, an architect, who made structures that could house his own pieces of sculpture and sold the drawings necessary to make the houses in order to raise the money, since he's a very known artist. So this drawing would be sold somewhere in New York in order to build the building, in order to then put his own work inside it. A sort of interesting loop. And an architect who I hope will come here again to give a lecture. He hasn't lectured in London for quite some time, and who I think has been sort of slightly kicked into touch by other people who borrow his ideas and then make more noise about it. This is Neil Denari. And I'm not showing his drawings on this occasion. I'm just showing some built work. It is exquisite and takes you into another level of architectural production. And at last he's building a high-rise in New York. Not a very high-rise, but at least a 17th-floor high-rise, I think. And finally, somebody who I would have never had the opportunity to meet of an earlier period still, Hans Polzig. If I could transport myself back in time, I would love to meet Hans Polzig and find out what actually made him tick. Okay. Brett Steele has asked me to give an evening lecture sometime soon, which will actually have my stuff in it. So I will. Thank you.